After the Persian Wars, Sparta and Athens wielded a lot of influence among the other Greek city-states. States who were now clearly articulating a shared Greekness as opposed to the others, mostly the Persian allies. These two nations didn't get along well. Athens was led by a democracy that privileged citizens of all classes over non-citizens. But this system was largely unsustainable without the exploitation of either a large number of non-citizens or the burdening of a few Athenian elite. Sparta's government remained an elite oligarchy where the Gerousia assembly controlled the Spartan citizen soldiers, but their entire state rested upon the agricultural production of the subjected Helots. While the differences may not seem that profound to modern eyes, many of the Greek oligarchies like Sparta felt threatened by the Athenian loosening of social status in their democracy. Sparta and Athens signed a peace treaty to preserve peace between them, but a series of earthquakes and Helot revolts provided an opportunity for Athens to ignore the agreement. Athens fortified their city and the road linking it to the nearby critical port of Piraeus, guaranteeing their access to the sea and trade. Then, using their naval and economic power, they began to form a league of small coastal and island nations, called the Delian League. The Delian League was supposed to be an alliance of equals who donated funds to a common treasury that built ships to defend against future Persian aggression. However, the construction and manning of this navy was under Athenian control, and by the 430s BC, the League was in reality an Athenian empire. Members of the League were no longer free to leave, there were mandatory trade relations with Athens, and they were forced to adopt aspects of Athenian democracy. These political shifts uniformly hampered the traditional elites in these states and promoted pro-Athenian factions from the middle classes. States who wished to resist Athens were naturally drawn to an alliance with Sparta. And Sparta was gradually recovering from their problems earlier in the 5th century BC. The Cold War between these two and their allies eventually spiraled into real combat. We call this the Peloponnesian War, and it lasted roughly 30 years. This war brought out some weaknesses in Athenian democracy. The large legislative and judicial bodies were slow and unwieldy, making wartime response very difficult. In addition, the loss of many skilled and educated elites during the war meant that a lot of the legislative decisions in Athens were made by the common people, who at this time were largely illiterate, uneducated, and lacking in political experience. Policy was often merely the emotional will of the mob. Sparta and her allies proved victorious, and in 404 BC they sacked Athens, dismantled the Delian League, and ended the Athenian democracy. However, Sparta was unable to consolidate power over Greece due to their social structure. By 371, the situation in Greece was chaos. The big picture was that Athens and Sparta had bled themselves dry in the Peloponnesian War, and they were no longer able to manage powerful city-states that rivaled them. There was a new parity between Greek city-states, and this led to widespread conflict and disunity. Enter Macedonia. Macedonia was situated in the northern part of the Balkan Peninsula. Macedon was generally not considered Greek at all. It was a rougher, more isolated nation with a monarchy that depended upon warrior families for support. However, the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars resulted in a high demand for Macedonia's main product, timber, and they found themselves well off by the 370s. They also had a strong visionary leader, Philip. Philip implemented a strong policy of Hellenization, a term that means being Greek. He imported Athenian architects, Greek dramatists, and philosophical scholars. He pushed for his nation's inclusion in the Greek identity of us. Philip also reorganized the Macedonian army, improving on the expensive but effective Greek phalanx. The Greek states depended on elite warriors with metal armor and swords that fought in unison. This demands a lot of expense and training. Situations like you would see in Sparta, where you had soldiers who trained most of their lives. Philip armed his men with long, heavy wooden spears and used these both offensively and defensively, thereby saving money on armor and swords and enabling him to put a lot more of his men in the field. This Macedonian phalanx allowed Philip to dominate southern Greece by 336, forcing the city-states to join his League of Corinth. Philip intended to use this united Greece to invade the Persian territories in modern-day Turkey. He wanted to gain control over the waterway linking the Black and Mediterranean seas, which carried lots of important trade goods. Unfortunately for him, Philip was assassinated shortly afterwards, leaving the League under the control of his 18-year-old son and heir, Alexander.